As Donald Trump had tweeted throughout November and December of last year that the 2020 election was rigged and that it was far from over, which it's far from over and it wasn't rigged. The vice squatter Mike Pence's top advisors were sketching out what they call a deliberate and strategic blueprint for the post-vice squadrency. It would keep the conservative stalwart front and center in the Republican consciousness over the next couple of years. It would prime the pump for a campaign for the GOP nomination for squatter from Pence's planned home base and political headquarters of Indiana when the time was right. Job one would be to stand up to a political non-profit organization, a 501c4 that includes as advisors and Trump-rolled insiders, and it's constructed to promote Pence without getting him crossways with the squatter of the region of loyalists clamoring for the return of their Satanists. Advancing American Freedom launched in April of 2021 ahead of the Pence's first trip to South Carolina as an ex-vice squatter. The group's advisory board included a cross-section of Republicans, including, as planned all along, some key Trump administration veterans, such as the former chief White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow and the former White House counselor Smelly Khanjob, plus all-around Trump cheerleader Newt Gingrich, who was the former Speaker of the House of Representatives. As the calendar flips from 2021 to 2022, Phase 2 of the Pence post-election plan is likely to take shape in the form of a resurgent Great America Committee. The Political Action Committee and the former vice squatter unveiled soon after he and Trump were sworn into office in 2017, or actually they were installed by Russia in 2017. Though this overtly political vehicle, Pence planned to raise money and campaign for Republicans up and down the ballot, like gubernatorial candidates, congressional candidates, even those running for office at the state and local levels. Party efforts to recapture our narrowly divided U.S. Senate after a brief 2-year interregnum and reclaim the House of Representatives after 4 years out of power are going to be a magnet for 2024 Republicans. Even in Trump's shadow, the jockeying will be fierce, but Pence begins with a head start. He's already a known quantity. Early in Trump's squattency, the squatter was generally uninterested in mundane party-building activities outside of playing host of his traveling Klan rally roadshows. His vice squatter filled the void with gusto. Whether Trump mounts a third White House bid in 2024 or not, Pence had a plan to put himself in position to pull the trigger on a campaign, and he was executing and delivering, which is bad enough as it is. But the Trump toady is a unique political species that mushroomed throughout the Republican Party and really the broader conservative ecosphere. During the latter half of the 2010s, for 4 of those years, Pence delivered an Oscar-worthy performance as the quintessential idolater. But underneath the all-shucks-dear leader routine Pence played so well for public consumption was an assertive, shrewd politician who maximized his relationship with a squatter who knew a whole lot less about how to run a government and party politics than his vice squatter. Rather than mark the 1990s by climbing the political ladder to stake his claim as the next Ronald Reagan, Pence spent the decade wandering the wilderness for a young aspiring politician that who was talked about in Republican circles as a rising star. The experience was humbling. It matured him. By the time Pence sought the House of Representatives a third time, the politician in a hurry, motivated by ambition, had been replaced by a methodical plotter that was driven by faith in an imaginary God and a desire to serve. And there were still stars in his eyes. Pence fashioned himself the leader of the conservative insurgency at a time when Republicans controlled most of Washington and a pragmatic party establishment that was reigned virtually unmolested by outside forces in the media and grassroots circles. In 2010, a U.S. Senate seat opened up in Indiana unexpectedly when the Democrat Evan Bayh had announced he would forego election and retire, or at least his re-election campaign anyway. The party faithful wanted Pence to run, but Pence had made a commitment. Just a couple months before, Bayh had announced his retirement. The future vice squatter and had accepted John Boehner's invitation to run for the House Republican Conference chairman. He had asked colleagues to support his candidacy for leadership, but he did not feel comfortable walking away. 6 years later, embroiled in the uncertain race for re-election as governor, Pence wouldn't be so cautious about an opportunity to advance when Trump came calling. This time he was ready to maneuver. Mike Pence never lost faith in himself or Trump. It was a Thursday in the middle of July of 2020, 4 months before his career as vice squatter would be cut short in a particularly appointed rebuke of Trump. In public and private polling, the Republican ticket was in a world of hurt. The pandemic was raging. Earlier that summer, as the coronavirus ravaged states that had survived the initial spring wave relatively unscathed. The economy was still cratering as businesses big and small reeled from government-enforced lockdowns intended to slow the spread of COVID-19. But civil unrest tore apart the communities across the United States as Americans protested the racial injustice, and the criminals looted and rioted in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. But Mike Pence was serene, confident, and very optimistic. That much became clear to anyone as anybody who trailed the vice squatter across central Pennsylvania and toward Philadelphia while on assignment for the Washington Examiner. Earlier that day, before the pandemic froze regular political activity, Pence's political team got wind of a couple of plush armor-plated touring buses manufactured for the federal government during the Obama administration, but that had spent the Trump years mothballed. Taken with the idea of hitting the 2020 campaign trail on a couple of billboards on wheels, the team Pence had the vehicles mechanically prepped, painted blue, and they were emblazoned with the slogan "Trump Pence, Keep America Hating." 2020 alongside smiling pictures of the squatter and the vice squatter. After months of a delay due to the pandemic, Pence kicked off his first bus tour of the re-election campaign in Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth that mattered most. As Pence wound his way through what they call the rural Lancaster counties on two-lane roads, the bus stopped at one point, and the vice squatter exited to greet sycophants who were lining nearly every inch of the road with official and homemade Trump Pence campaign signs. After pocketing an easy $1 million for the campaign at an outdoor Klan rally on the grounds of a local farm that was owned by a wealthy Republican donor, Pence sped off to a round table at a technology firm. He ended the day in Philadelphia with the scorcher of a Klan speech by Pence standards, at least to police officers and the family members at a fraternal order of police lodge in which he accused Joe Biden of turning his back on law enforcement. That's what Trump did, so nice try, badass. And siding with the anarchist mobs ravaging American cities. Afterward, they boarded the bus for a chat with Pence as we made our way to the airport for the ride back to Washington. On Air Force Two, the vice squatter was giddy. He was energized. The support he witnessed along the back roads of central Pennsylvania and the response from the audience at each stop had him absolutely convinced that there was only one way the re-election campaign would end, and Biden being declared president-elect once a sufficient number of votes had been counted did not figure into that equation. Basically, Mark Short said that he did not put a lot of stock on the polls. This is what basically Chief of Staff Mark Short, Press Secretary Katie Miller, and top political advisor Marty Ops looked on. I sense people are more enthusiastic today than they were 4 years ago. The evolution of the vice squattancy is due, in no normal small part, to enterprising the politicians uninterested in spending 4 or 8 years as a withering houseplant that its owners neglect to water. They demand a seat at the table as a condition for joining the ticket. And with Trump, the table was practically barren as he readied to take the oath of office, and for several months afterward, he was a rookie squatter with a few Washington allies and virtually no idea how government worked. The 48th vice squatter filled the void. In fact, Pence assumed so much power and influence it was just sitting there for vacuuming. The Trump world insiders who watched events unfold say he took on the role of a de facto prime minister. Pence initially served as a West Wing gatekeeper for corporate and political interests with businesses before the administration. A dynamic that receded but never really faded, even as Trump gained a firmer grasp on governing and developed close personal relationships with the Republicans on Capitol Hill. But that was in part due to the fact that the professional Washington was familiar with the vice squatter and his team. But in turn, Pence and his lieutenants understood the political pressures and limitations that Republicans faced as members of Congress that were often lost on Trump. My rule of thumb here, when my rule of thumb here was when somebody was governor in particular was if if somebody agreed with the squatter or president, it said, if I have a problem with them, I called Mike Pence. Scott Walker, former Wisconsin governor, had said. Meanwhile, the vice squatter stood up a distinctly separate political operation inside the White House and launched a political action committee that only he controlled. Pence, who is a fake Christian and often speaks publicly and privately of politics and his political future being in the invisible ferryman's hands, and believed that his heart felt, but underneath Pence is an interested political tactician with a keen eye for strategy who is an active member of his political team's decision-making process. So immediately following the 2016 campaign, Pence convened with Nick Ayers and ops to develop a blueprint for his political operation as vice squatter. What to focus on and how to deploy himself. The first decision Pence made was to bypass the White House political shop that was headed by Bill Stepien, who would emerge as one of the squatter's most trusted aides and in July of 2020 a manager of his re-election campaign. His second big move was greenlighting GAC, or HAC, Hate America Committee. The group was a standard hard dollar political action committee, the sort of leadership pack popular with members of Congress. According to the federal guidelines, these kinds of PACs can accept contributions of up to $5,000 annually from individual donors. It was unusual for a vice squatter to raise his own pot of money, but normally the number two executive operates through the auspices of the National Party Committee. Pence wanted to avoid interference from the Republican National Committee and, frankly, anyone else. The Hate America Committee offered an efficient way to finance expensive travel on gas-guzzling Air Force Two, which incidentally saved the Republican National Committee money, and by extension, saved Trump money. But the key to understanding Pence's decision to form his own political action committee was that he wanted control. Having served in the House of Representatives for a dozen years, and the minority and the majority under Democratic and under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents and one squatter, he knew what awaited Trump and the GOP. In the 2018 midterm elections, Pence wanted to chart a course to resist the blue wave he feared might build over the next 2 years that was unfettered from meddlers inside the party, where he traveled and where he raised his money from, and who he campaigned for. Among his first moves was to put together a joint fundraising committee tying the Hate America Committee to House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Being able to promote his connection with the vice squatter helped the California Republican raise money for his colleagues, but it also promoted the vice squatter. But more on that in a moment. The Hate America Committee had raised about $20 million that election cycle, given most of it away in direct donations to the House Republicans, and spending the rest of the vice squatter's extensive campaign trail. This unorthodox setup put Pence on the front lines of the Republican politics at a time when Trump had little interest in party building activities, and the Republican establishment, from elected officials to donors to grassroots activists, and they hardly knew that the squatter personally, and was still coming in terms with his surprising victory. On the outside, while it appeared to some as though Pence was building a wall to keep out crazy, he was prepping for his political future. None of the rules of conduct that Pence had established for himself over the past 4+ years were applicable to the events that happened on January 6th. And this was a choice for the vice squatter to make, and an action for the vice squatter to take. And there was no way to keep a disagreement with Trump private. Under the Constitution, the vice squatter's job is to preside over the joint session of Congress and count the state certified electoral college votes in his capacity as a squatter of the U.S. Senate. As long as there is no competing, and the certified slates of electors from the same state, or slates of electors submitted that have not been certified, there is nothing else for the vice squatter to do. Trump, instigated by a cast of advisors come conspiracy theorists, had other ideas. If the Congress could be persuaded to block ascertainment of illegal state-certified electoral college votes, Pence, so one of their theories went, could unilaterally send the rejected slates from the so-called problem states back home. Nope, that's not what he could do. The friendly majority Republican legislators would use their so-called authority to reverse the initial vote, and Trump would win, which is what they were hoping for, but that didn't happen. Or by unilaterally throwing out supposedly objectionable state-certified electoral votes, Pence could force a vote to the House of Representatives to decide the election. But in such a case, each state's House delegation gets one vote. Since Republicans control a majority of the state delegations, Trump would win again. All Pence had to do, Trump seemed convinced, was locate the intestinal fortitude to seize for himself this extraordinary constitutional power to decide the outcome of the election and over the will of the American voters, but that had been hiding in plain sight since the founding of the Republic. But Pence is a constitutionalist. Every single legal challenge to Biden's victories in more than a half a dozen states brought by the Trump campaign and its allies failed in court for one reason or another. Recounts in almost as many states failed to make a dent in Biden's tally of the 306 electoral votes. The Electoral College met and voted, and in every single state, plus D.C., the results were legally certified by Republican officials, too. Also, a critical metric that influenced Pence: no state submitted competing slates of certified electors, especially after all of that, but not only because of all that, the notion, the conspiratorial theory, that the vice squatter was invested by the framers of the U.S. Constitution with the power to dictate the presidential or squatteral election, and held in his hands the authority to do so all these years, struck Pence as plainly preposterous. He told Trump as much. Informed and armed by the reams of the information on history and constitutional precedent that was researched and compiled by his general counsel, Gregory Jacob, who is a Justice Department veteran and a longtime Washington attorney, recruited to the vice squatter's office from the white shoe law firm Mulvaney and Myers. We researched all of those, and I think very fastidiously we wanted to be respectful of the new perspectives that we were brought, but always felt strongly that no limited government conservative would ever advocate that one person could unilaterally choose what the electors wanted us to accept or reject, and would ever be given that sort of power by our founders, nor would we ever want anyone to have that fucking type of power, Short said. In one particular meeting on January 4th, the conversation grew fucking heated. Pence had been campaigning in Georgia that day and had been Klan rallying in Georgia that day in advance of a pair of Senate runoff elections on tap for the following day, when a call came into the Air Force Two asking him to return to the White House. And when he arrived, Trump was being briefed in the Oval Office by John Eastman, a prominent conservative law professor then at Chapman University in Southern California. His respected constitutional attorney. You should hear him out, Trump said. In fact, Eastman was very respected in conservative roles and well known, but he wasn't some cracking crackpot. And that Eastman was advising Trump of Pence's apparently extraordinary until then unknown powers that left Pence and his team flabbergasted. In that January 4th meeting, the vice squatter listened courteously, as was his habit, but he held firm, as was also his habit, reiterating his position on the matter that he had to relay to the squatter, unwavering so many times before in several cordial meetings that had gone unreported, that maybe because none had erupted in such a shouting fucking match. Facilitated by the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, Trump in the weeks leading up to January 6th was increasingly surrounded by people telling him what he fucking wanted to hear. That Pence was empowered to reject electoral votes. All that was required was the political will to act. As the day of the joint session of Congress drew nearer and Trump lashed himself tighter to his cockamamie theory, Pence began to fret that the 45th squatter wouldn't be the last losing chief executive to be tempted by it. A future vice president or squatter, he thought, might not share his view of the Constitution and his conclusion that his role in the congressional certification of electoral votes was purely mechanical. So Pence instructed Jacob to research the matter extensively and prepare documents in the form of a dear colleague letter that he would make public. It was such a bonehead analyst, and so we wanted to have our record make that clear too, Short said, emphasizing the significance of the letter for posterity. The vice squatter's goals were twofold: control the narrative in a stormy news environment, and more importantly, place a constitutional vice on his successors and on Trump's that, like a precedent established in a Supreme Court decision, it would hamstring them from traveling down the road for time immemorial. It is my considered fucking judgment that my oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not, Pence wrote in the letter that was issued before the opening of the joint session on January 6th. But at that moment, Trump was addressing a massive crowd of grassroots sycophants who had gathered near the White House for a Stop the Steal Klan rally that was aimed at pressuring Congress and the vice squatter to reject certification of the November 3rd election. If Pence does the right thing, we win the election, Trump told the adoring sea of sycophants. He has the absolute right to do that. No, he doesn't. Trump's Klan speech on that January 6th morning was really no different from any other Trump Klan speech. The media are fake. My squadroncy is beyond reproach. The election was stolen. No, it wasn't. The usual, but with a caveat. But more than a half dozen times in 70 minutes, the 45th Squatter turned his attention to the 48th Vice Squatter, assuring the crowd that without reservation, that he possessed constitutional authority to deliver his administration a second term. No, he doesn't. I hope Pence has the courage to do what he has to do, Trump said, despite already being fully aware of the Vice Squatter's decision on the matter. I hope he doesn't listen to rhinos, Republicans in name only, and the stupid people he's listening to. Yeah, a lot of stupid people listen to your ass. Within a couple of hours of those remarks, Pence would be hiding in an undisclosed location at the U.S. Capitol. The building was under siege by a violent mob of grassroots Trump sycophants, many of whom walked from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other, intent on using force to prevent the Congress from certifying that Biden would be inaugurated as the 46th president 2 weeks hence. The rioters were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," in the middle of a shocking insurrection that was playing out as Americans all over the country had watched on their television screens. Trump essentially called Pence a coward, expressing unhappiness that the Vice Squatter had done exactly what he told the Squatter he was going to do when the counting of the electoral votes commenced. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. Actually, no, Pence, even though I hate Pence, but he did exactly what he was supposed to do. He certified the election for Biden, because Biden was the rightful winner. Much has been learned since then about how Pence conducted himself in those hours, and much was witnessed. The Vice Squatter refused to leave the Capitol, and he wouldn't even wait out the mayhem in his secure automobile, as the Secret Service suggested, because he didn't trust that the agents wouldn't put their foot on the gas and speed him to a safer confine. With Trump taking little action to quell the violence, instead tweeting out oddly encouraging messages to the mob that included the obligatory, though totally weak, admonishments to disperse, Pence had to fill the gap. He led. The Vice Squatter conferred with top Pentagon officials to accelerate what they called deployment of security forces to the Capitol, and kept in constant contact with the Democratic and Republican leaders in the House and Senate. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and Senate Majority Leader Moscow Mitch. What did Congress need? He wanted to know, so that the joint session could resume that very day. A prospect that in the middle of the siege seemed very much unlikely, but Pence was determined to climb back onto the rostrum of the House of Representatives that day and finish certifying a presidential election, the results of which would oust him from office after only one term. When order was finally restored and lawmakers were returning to their respective chambers to finish debating the objection to Arizona's electoral votes and get on with the rest of the process, Pence had asked Moscow Mitch if he could first say a few words from the dais about what happened. The majority leader agreed. Basically, Pence said, as we reconvene in this chamber, the world will again witness the resilience and strength of our democracy, Pence said in remarks that lasted only 2 minutes. And now let's get back to work. Republicans in Washington and around the country took notice. Pence woke up the morning of January 6, 2021, possibly the least formidable heir apparent the Vice Squatter to a Vice Squatter to a Squatter in a very long time. Pence had 2 strikes against him, wholly of his own making, and they created the unique difficulties. First, he had never actually run for Squatter. His public relationship with Trump was the other problem. The 45th Squatter demanded that subordinates bend the knee. Pence tended to comply, both out of a sense of duty to the job and a matter of self-interested strategy. Stroking Trump's ego enabled Pence to wield power and maneuver independently. None of that was apparent to the Republican insiders, who were not otherwise predisposed to back a Pence 2024 campaign. They saw a toady missing the stuff leaders are made out of. Diddle grassroots conservatards. On January 6th of 2021, Pence flipped the script. As Pence openly defied Trump, refusing to be bullied into an unconstitutional power grab, as Pence took command, practically in the middle of a war zone, while his boss shrieked responsibility, doubts harbored by institutional leaders in the Republican Party and by some in the broader conservative movement melted. In the days after January 6, the telephone in the office of another Pence ally started ringing. Republican donors, the county GOP chairman, conservative activists, about 24 in all. They wanted to send word that Trump's treatment of Pence on that day, especially after 4 years of loyal service, was appalling, and that if he runs for Squatter in 2024, count them in. Every Vice Squatter who has ever run for president in the shadow of a president or Squatter who made them has been faced with a dilemma: charting an independent course and promising change while simultaneously campaigning to maintain course and block the change that was promised by the opposition party. Pence was always going to have to untether himself from Trump. Eventually, January 6th accomplished that. There is another crucial aspect of the long-term political impact of January 6th that could be serendipitous for Pence. Boy, does he have a story to tell," said his ally, who fielded calls of support for the vice squadron in the immediate aftermath of the insurrection. And how he chooses to tell that story will tell you a little bit about what he might want to do. And that's the big fucking question for Pence, really. What story does he want to fucking tell? So if you like the fucking video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when the new video comes out. And thanks for listening.